Welcome, everyone, to NASCAD Artwork Alumni Talks. While our community is a global one, our school, and by extension these talks, are hosted in Kjipuktuk, Mi'kmaq, and the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. We're honored to gather, speak, and make artwork here. My name is Molly Cronin, and I am the host of NASCAD Artwork Talks. And each month I have the opportunity to speak with two of our esteemed alum about where their careers have taken them since their time at NASCAD. And this week I'm really excited to be talking about human-centered design with John deWolf, BDes 1992, and Lesley Palfreyman, BDes 2002. So Lesley and John, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Maybe we could just do like a very short introduction. You could tell us a little bit about where you're based and the kind of work you do. John, I'm looking at you. Maybe we could start with you.
Sure. I'm John deWolf. I have a Bachelor of Design from NASCAD and a Master of Interior Design from University of Manitoba. I run Narrative Environment Studio based here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And my work is probably best described as experiential graphic design. So the areas of my practice include visual identity and brand management, interpretive planning and exhibit design, and signage and wayfinding.
Hey, thanks, John. Lesley, same to you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm calling in from Seattle on Salish land here. Love that is recognized. And yeah, I graduated with a Bachelor of Design from NASCAD in 2002. And I also got a minor in digital media. That was a very exciting time to be learning digital media. So I paid attention to that as well. And that led to my career in user experience design and more recently, product design, research, and strategy. And I just finished, wrapped up 15 years at Amazon Music. So hoping to share some of those experience I went through today.
Amazing. Well, before we get into that, I'd love to talk a bit about your time at NASCAD. And Lesley, you said that it was an exciting time in those early years of the 2000s. Can you talk a bit about what you were studying at NASCAD, what brought you there, who you were working with, and the sort of things that you were interested in at the time?
Yeah, well, I was definitely attracted to NASCAD. That's the university I knew I wanted to go to when I was applying to different colleges and universities. And what I was attracted to was that it really did recognize design as its own full discipline. So it was the only school at that time that offered a Bachelor of Design degree. And on top of that, it had an honors program. So there were no masters available at the time. And then with, the growing trends that kind of came while I was at school, it was something that, only a few students were really diving into it. And I thought, there's something here. I got to start learning it as soon as I can. So that was something I was attracted to as well. And I loved the studio environment. I loved sitting in a room with my peers. I loved the thesis and the public presentation. It really taught us how to think, not just how to use the tools and build the skill. So I was very much attracted to that.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. John, this will be fun because you're, I think, currently teaching at NASCAD, but you also were a student there in the 90s. So can you talk a bit about what brought you to NASCAD and what you were working on at the time? And I don't know, maybe a comment about what you're doing now as a teacher as well, if you'd like.
Yeah. So I enrolled in 1998 after pretty well flunking a year of sciences at St. Mary's University. I wanted to become an architect, and I thought a year of sciences and then a year art school would be a good fit. And so after a year-long foundation program, I discovered graphic design. And unlike today, graphic design wasn't really part of the common vernacular in the late 80s and early 90s. But immediately I sort of saw the synergies between design and the built environment. To answer your questions, who was I working with? I think I respected Tony Mann, an instructor, and sort of his looseness and creativity, something I've never been able to achieve, but admired. Jay Rutherford was a typographer and introduced me to typography, and that's when I really understood sort of the power of the presentation of the written word, and he became a long-time mentor. However, I think it was I would say it's the critical thinking of Han Oasis that laid the foundation for my career. His perspectives on rhetorical thinking formed the vocabulary of my design. though it took a really long time for me to understand it and a master's degree for me to sort of implement it in a different way. And I think from that perspective, I always want to work with the students and talk about the importance of communication, that we're dealing with a user and we're trying to figure out how best to communicate with them, and whether it's through rhetoric or through pure good UX UI or just well-written copy, that it's such a critical part, the communication aspect of what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and my follow-up question to this was, I think you've sort of touched on, was what about your education at NASCAD did you sort of carry through with you? It sounds like you've touched on it a little bit, but can you elaborate a bit, John?
Yeah, for me, Hannah's rhetorical thinking, every single project to this day, every time I start, I go back to those schemes and tropes. And I find them an amazing tool for looking at different avenues, different approaches, different ways to solve a problem, whether it's the built environment. I think we might have some images later from Batosh, or a brochure or logo. It's always an amazing starting point. But mentioned it was also the starting point, in the sense that it took me a while to understand how to use them and incorporate them into my work. But I was also looking at them as small nuggets, and it wasn't until I went to the University of Manitoba to study interior design that I started exploring narratology and theories of the narrative, and that's when I understood how these atoms, these rhetorical
Mm.
figures and schemes could be applied in a much bigger way.
Thanks, John. Lesley, a similar question to you. Can you talk a bit? You talked a bit about what was so exciting and sort of drew you to NASCAD in that period. But what do you think were some of the lessons or strategies that you developed at NASCAD that you've carried with you in your career?
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely plus one to what we learned from Hanno. He was again one of the people I was really attracted to working with and learning from, and he just brought such a unique way of thinking and approaching design, and it really was lasting because
Mm.
just like John said, it's all about communication. It's all about connecting with the person who is experiencing that design. And then you need to kind of take the stories of the business or the product or the goals and put it into a space that you can be hands off, and it can talk to that individual. It can lead them through the steps that they need to go through. It can help them understand, why should I be using this? What's the benefit? So yeah, so what we're showing right here is a little bit of this user-centered design process. This isn't mine. This is something that's been around for a while. It was created by Don Norman, who was actually a cognitive scientist, and it really started the beginnings of a design practice that was a process which started from people, from the human, rather than sometimes what happens, which is, I have an idea. I think this is going to be great. I'm going to build this thing. And, a business or a product might jump straight to a solution. This doesn't do that. It actually observes the people and it understands them, and it works from the problems and the needs that they have. So throughout that process, you need to kind of really understand communication and how it works, whether it's visual, which we learned at NASCAD. It's a lot about visual communication. But later in my career, I had to apply it to voice. I had to apply it to language. And what we learned absolutely translates over. So it was very scalable. It was very flexible, what we learned. And again, it was about the thinking, about the understanding who are the people that we need to communicate with. So that's why user-centered design has been such a great practice and such a great partner with what we learned at NASCAD.
Okay, I'm going to ask a quick terminology question. Do you guys prefer user-centered or human-centered design in the language that we're using today? Are they interchangeable?
Good question. It's been a big debate. In the end, they are people. I think user-centered, user experience, that became, a common term, but kind of takes you away from the human side of it. Same with the word customer. Sometimes when
Right.
thinking about like who is the customer, it's like, well, they may not be a customer yet. They might just be an audience. So
Mm,
at the end of the day, they are people.
okay. Sounds like a bit of both, but that there's something maybe different going on when we use the word human-centered. It's a little more intentional, or a little more a little more about the kind of human being rather than the capitalism interaction that's going on there. So
Right,
that's good to
right.
know.
Yeah.
Um, Well, that's great. That was my next question, was asking to hear a little bit more about our topic today, about human-centered design. So it sounds like this, Lesley, this was something that came up for you in NASCAD. Is there anything else you want to say about your relationship to this sort of like way of working and how it's impacted your design process?
Yeah, well, I think over time, as more and more professionals have adopted this practice, it has evolved. So the former slide we showed was where Don Norman started. And again, he's a cognitive science
Mm,
scientist. So the way he mapped this out, it can be difficult for some to kind of translate that into, well, what does this mean? How do I go through these steps? What is specify user requirements and solutions and evaluate? What does that really mean? So that next slide there is a bit of the evolution where designers have taken it and they said, yes, it is a process. We're going to start with really the discovery phase, which is we're going to do our research. We're going to learn about the customers and what their needs are. We're going to learn about people, and we're going to go really, really big. And maybe we'll start talking about all the different possible things that we could do for them. But then we're going to start to converge, and we are going to pick some of those and really define what it is. So get to the root of that problem and really be specific and clear about it. So again, back to the time at NASCAD, writing a thesis really forced us to do that. We couldn't
mm,
just jump to putting something on the page. We had to articulate it. We had to think it through, and going through that process was a big challenge, and it was a wonderful learning opportunity. So this double diamond method is a process that, lots of designers have gone through, and then once they get to the definition, they start designing, they start developing those ideas, they sketch them out, they might do user journeys, they might start testing it again, and then they go really wide, and then they start to figure out, okay, we got it. Now we got to really deliver it, and we got to converge again, and then we get this outcome. So this looks very linear. And I think what
mm,
really needs to be emphasized here is it's not. So if you go to the next slide, this is kind of you know, my way of showing it to people that's a little bit more practical rather than academic. So this discovery phase, it's really a flywheel. The product might already exist. You've learned about it, but you got to go out because things change. Culture changes, technology changes, people change. So you got to go out, you got to discover again. That could be qualitative research, people you're working with, the stakeholder interviews, what are the limitations, what are the goals, start ideating with some of your peers, and then define that. Maybe do some quantitative research to kind of really get a good idea of the volume of interest in particular ideas. Really define the goals, the criteria, the user journeys, the minimum MLP there is minimum lovable product. What's the absolute simplest form that this can ship in? And then
mm,
develop, this is a bigger design process where you go in, you map it out, you get the user interface, you get the patterns, you get the journeys, you go really deep, and hopefully lots of usability testing and iteration. Then finally, the delivery. So often you need to make sure it's working and it's scalable. So you do beta testing, you measure some of the behaviors, you evaluate that, and often you ship it. But then you start it over again. You got to go back and you got to see how are
mm.
people actually using it. And it just starts over again. So don't think of it just as a linear process. It's something that is continuous.
Okay, that is very helpful. Thank you, Lesley. Those are really helpful visuals. Well, John, maybe we'll jump into that question with you too and ask you a bit about your relationship to human-centered design and how it shapes your relationship to collaboration, consultation, research, and the overall design practice.
Sure. And maybe I'll just add one thing. I think the term human-centered design is really new to me. It's just I've
Oh,
discovered in the last couple of years, but when I go back and look at 3 decades of work, I realize I've been using user experience forever. For many of the wayfinding projects, we developed personas and journey maps, and a lot of prototyping, and maybe I'll talk about one of those stories. So I recognize that I've been using it for a long time, and
Mm.
it's really exciting now to, together with the students, to discover the additional research in this and theory behind it and apply that based on experience and new work. For me, I discovered it in the late 90s when we were working on a software tool, and we started with paper prototyping where we would have these big binders of maquettes for software. It'd be like a choose your own adventure style, meaning if you hit yes, turn to page 20. If you hit no, turn to page 46, etc. And so user testing, journey maps, etc., have always been part of my work. And I suppose now what I'm doing is digging deeper into the common use terms for human-centered design, like many of the pieces that Lesley just spoke about, and using those common definitions to help describe to
Mm.
clients and to my team members and to the subject matter experts that we hire, the approach that we're taking, and then having those common terms and a lot of literature written about it. Young designers, clients can understand or better understand how we work. But I recognize that I've been doing this for a long time, even though I haven't had the terms to describe it.
Oh, well, that's a nice development.
Yeah.
Um, can you think of any particular project where this language feels useful or where it helped you communicate with some of the participants or research you were doing? I know it's a newer term to you, so maybe it's like a retroactive application of the terminology, but
I think we were talking about Seattle because I
yeah.
spent some time there, but that signage program, I remember quite clearly us developing user personas and journey maps. So user personas, what are the typical type of users? The rush hour user, the midday user, the user coming in from Tacoma, the user coming in from north on the commuter train, and what
Mm.
are their special needs, and working with clients on on refining those so that we could use those when we're looking at the sign system that we're developing. Um, Journey maps was another, sorry, that would be the journey maps, the personas, or what are they feeling? What emotions are they going through? Um, have I missed the train? What do we do for recovery elements, etc.? Um, that certainly was one where we started using it. Um,
Mm.
yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question.
I think so. And it's so interesting to hear the kind of mix of like research and kind of imagining that happens and almost character building that happens in the design process.
True. And then there are actually real life ones where, we do work with clients. So in New York, there are many times where we'd be behind the mirrored glass and there'd be a moderator in the room and working with users on these mock-ups or these tests, and we could feed questions through an earpiece or watch them manage and ask the right questions. But again, I think the big part of this is trying to have a better connection with the user, whether
Mm.
that's doing research to imagine them or to put them into different groupings that everyone can understand. And of course, the hands-on sort of interacting with your working and observing how people engage with the products and the environments that you're creating.
Right. So interesting. Well, Lesley, I mean, it's so interesting to me to move from this idea of like physical wayfinding into the work you do in these digital realms. And I wonder if you could speak a bit about how some of these principles apply in the designing of digital spaces and kind of what unique challenges and opportunities have presented themselves to you working this way.
Yeah, well, I think back to what John was saying, user journeys, personas, and so on. I think sometimes the challenge is what are the resources that a designer has to go through these steps. Sometimes it can be very rushed, and we may not be able to go in depth and really talk to actual people who are
Mm.
using those, and that's where personas can be very, very helpful. It's like, if we can't talk to them, let's at least talk about some of the core use cases that they go through that we know as designers and as people, we should be made very aware of. But then the fun part is when there is more time, when there is more budget, and you're doing the research, you can cast a little bit of a wider net, and that's part of the process that, you know, can be challenged, but also extremely delightful. I always love it when I think I know what some of the core journeys or problems are, and then I'm talking to people, whether it's through, you know, behind the mirror or with them. There's great ways of doing it. There's field research where you actually go out and you're walking with people and you're really experiencing their lives, and it's fascinating. And there's so many times where I'm just surprised. I'm like, I never thought of that. I never thought of that. Or even in early research, you think you start to see patterns in qualitative research, which is usually, you know, 6 to 10 people, and you start to see patterns emerge. But then later, when you throw some of those ideas into a quantitative survey and you add a few just to kind of add some variation, suddenly one of those ones that you added because you had an instinct about it pops up. You're like, wow, this didn't come up. So those are some of the challenges sometimes. You know, we don't always have the resources to really go deep to fully understand it. And that's really when our skill as designers comes in, and our practice and understanding of these principles that you see in front of you, that you really have to apply. So being people-centered, we talked about that a lot. Solving the right problem, that itself can be a process. So sometimes designers will realize that, wow, you know, I'm being asked to build something, it's incredibly complex. One of our jobs is to simplify it. So how can we find out what's the right problem? Let's go to the root of that problem. And it might not be the issue that was brought to us at the beginning. It might be a far simpler one or a far more complex one. So really simplifying that and writing it down and getting the stakeholders aligned. And then thinking in a system, everything is a system. So this is where the journeys can come in. And one that comes to mind is, as I was working with a lot of customers on Amazon Music, one of our big groups of customers were people who were members of the Prime membership. And they had a certain way of thinking. They had a certain type of relationship. And I couldn't just think of, all right, who is this music customer coming into this experience? I had to think, this is a Prime member. They are in many different parts of the site, and they have certain expectations. They engage with it a certain way. I need to think about this as a bigger system beyond our product. So that could come down to simple things like, am I using the right language they're familiar with? You know, language that is consistent. So I'd work with the Prime team and I'd say, tell me about them. Tell me what you've learned. Tell me what you've produced, what works and what doesn't work. So I can take that and think about it as a bigger system. And then the small and simple interventions, this is more about making iterative improvements. So the music industry has evolved dramatically. When I first joined, a few months after, we launched a product called Cloud Player. And it was the first time, instead of buying an MP3, sideloading it to your device, uploading it, trying to find an app that would play it, it was incredibly difficult. We said you can buy the MP3, and if you install the app, it's just there. That was actually a challenge for customers. I was like, wait, you know, that's changing my habits. I don't get it. How did that show up there? And they're like, well, it's in the cloud. What's the cloud? Metaphor. Right. Hanno, you know, going back to those learnings, this is a metaphor. How do we help them understand what it means? And they get it flipped around sometimes. I need to download it to the cloud. And you're like, no, cloud's up. So those are some challenges there. And it's a lot of combination of the visuals, the language, the actions and behaviors to help educate them about it. And then fast forward 5 to 10 years later, now they're on a voice device and they can just ask for a song and it's there. We couldn't jump to that, obviously. We had to do small iterative improvements so that adoption curve wasn't too sharp for those customers. So those are some of the changes that happen over time, gradually improving the product through these iterations, again, back to that flywheel, to ease that adoption and make it comfortable to use.
Okay, that's such an interesting example too, because you're right. It is such a simple, like visual and language cue to give to the users, right? To help them imagine how something is working. Yeah, that's a great example. Thank you so much. John, I want to ask you about a particular design of yours as well, or a project that you worked on with students. And this one
Sure.
seems to me very um, connected to like the human beings that you're working with because it was for a series of healthcare um, devices. So can you talk a bit about the projects that you and Rebecca Schultz worked on in the last few years with your students in relation to healthcare?
Yeah, absolutely. So over a 2-year period, we worked with Nova Scotia Health on two projects. One was the colon cancer prevention program kit, and the second was working for the Nova Scotia Rehabilitation and Arthritis Center, and that was in last fall, 2025. The course is intended to introduce students to the principles of human-centered design and a systems thinking approach to problem solving. So we grouped the students into 3 or 4 groups, and for 14 weeks they worked on the same project, which was quite different than many other courses they'd taken up to that point. And the idea was to have the 3 groups look at the products they're creating or they're putting out to patients and propose changes. So the goal is really to sort of have 3 or 4 very different approaches to improving their products to be better aligned with the needs of patients. So we had the students develop patient personas, so generalized personas about typical patient groups. They went through journey maps, storyboards, in order to sort of identify the patient types and their needs and how they interact with the authority. And we also developed system maps as well. And part of it was trying to show the students that these are not sort of small, discrete, a brochure, a poster, whatever, but they work in a big interconnected communication and interaction
Mm,
environment where they have many interactions with numerous people, and these things don't work alone. They work with nurses talking to them, with other patients, etc. Unfortunately, and not maybe not so much unfortunately, but without a formal academics review, the students could not interact directly with patients. And I think
oh,
Lesley
of
even
course.
spoke to this as well, right? So that sometimes we just don't have the means or the fees or the ability to
Right.
interact with people. And that's where this patient personas is really helpful. And that's where thinking about journey maps, etc. So the research was somewhat anecdotal, but they did interview the instructors about their experiences with the colon cancer kit. So Glenn and myself are over 50, so we have had to do the test. They spoke to relatives, they spoke to aunts, uncles, people who've been in the hospital, etc. In the colon cancer case, each student had to perform the kit, the test on their own, and that was absolutely amazing.
Mm,
And then they worked with nurses, staff, and patient family advisors. Patient family advisors are people who've been through the system as a patient and then help newcomers to the programs better understand the process. And I think with all that, they gained the insight that they needed to move forward. And I think the presentations were both enlightening for the students, certainly for the client as well. I remember many aha moments, or Lesley, you said something, but we did some work for the pharmacy department, and all labels are usually written around the edge, and one student turned it on its side so that you could read perfectly. And I remember one of the staff members saying, we've been doing this for 40 years and never even thought that was possible. But that was an outcome of the process and really thinking about how people handle things, how people need to read things. And it was an amazing experience that way. And I think it also, I would say that for Nova Scotia Health, they really were exposed to us talking about human-centered design and then examples or concrete examples of how that could work and an outcome that they saw that was very,
mm.
very a much better improvement on what they had. So Yeah, it was a great experience, and I think the students also came out of it a better understanding that there are tools and methods to help them better understand connecting with the end user, visitor, client, whatever you want to call them.
Mhm.
But for me as well, I think, and this is a personal belief, but I believe that as designers, as a designer, I should be anonymous in the situation or in the end product. No one should be able to look at this label on a vial and say, "Oh, John deWolf designed that," or "This company
Right.
designed that." We're
Yeah.
just conduits to connecting clients with their end users. And Lesley has spoken to this as well. But the more we can design the process and the tools to help everyone have a better understanding of who they're working for, even if that means changing the design brief or the problem brief in the process, that's critical to what we do. And so I think for some students, the notion of I can do my design work can be applied for the public good, and it isn't
Mhm.
always about my personal taste or style. It's about what the user needs. To me, that was a huge win.
That's so interesting, the kind of way that ego maybe gets taken out of it. And it's saying it's not about the personal expression of the designer in this particular example. It's about the service that that design provides. Am I understanding
Yeah,
correctly?
absolutely. And particularly when you're talking about trying to reach big, broad public
Yeah.
audiences, right? It really is about understanding what they need. And I think it's less about
Hmm.
my interests, my perspectives, and more about how we make that connection. I don't know if Lesley wanted to add to that, but
Yeah, no, I agree. Sometimes I've seen a parallel in great actors and actresses, where
yeah,
sometimes at the end you're like, oh my gosh, that was so and so. I didn't even see
Hmm.
them.
yeah,
Versus when you're watching a certain film, you're like, oh, it's this action
yeah,
actor. I know, I can't, I see the actor, I don't see the character. So
Yeah.
it's a lot like that. And I'd say, yeah, I think the other role is we need to, as best as possible, help represent the brand. The brand
yeah,
is the face, the
yeah,
brand comes with it. And sometimes the brand isn't there. In an information graphic system, it might not be. But in other environments, if you're working with a client, give me the brand guide. I worked with Cisco once, and they had just started a brand guide, and they said, okay, here it is, do something with it. And I was like, okay, and I'll use these guidelines, and here you go. Is this right?
yeah.
And they're like, perfect, great. So it's
Mm.
really embracing that like an actor or an actress would,
Yeah.
and deeply understanding it, and putting that on fully and committing to it. And then, yes, like Joan said, possibly going back to the client and saying, well, have you considered this? Because this is what I'm hearing from the people who are receiving this. Maybe we need to adjust a little bit.
Yeah.
So interesting. I love that comparison to the actor. That's a really interesting one,
So do I. It's
and
great.
illustrative. Well, Leslie, when before we were talking about you were talking about this sort of like how to gradually make changes in the design process to sort of bring users into this new way of navigating. And I was thinking about when we were corresponding before this talk, you were talking about um, your interest in AI. And I think that talking about human-centered design in AI is so interesting because I think we understand a lot of the human costs involved around the environment and around plagiarism. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how human-centered design can be applied potentially to AI and especially as we're not so maybe gradually being introduced to it, or it feels very like a quick big shift has happened in the world. But yeah, if you have any thoughts on how human-centered design and AI are kind of shaping up for you in this industry.
Yeah. Well, there's some great adoption infographics out there. I encourage folks to look at, because we do go through this kind of roller coaster ride of adoption, and you have the early adopters, the laggards, and so on. And what I've been noticing is this is happening faster and faster and
Yeah.
faster. So even the past few years, we've gone through a few roller coaster dips in that adoption curve. Yes, when I was writing to you, I said, I finished at Amazon and I want to focus my time now because there's a lot of interesting things happening. They're happening very fast, and I feel I really need to be focused on it to understand it. So that's the first step. Even if it's intimidating or scary or whatever, use the tools, go in, get familiar with it. So then you can build an opinion and you can say, this is what it's good for, this is what it's not good for. And for the product people building that, they'll really appreciate that if they're human-centered companies, and give the feedback and say, I don't like what is happening here. So an example of that I can put into practical terms, and just the past few days, there's been some news around it, but music again. We talk about plagiarism and art and other crafts and forms that feel a bit threatened at the moment. In music, there's a lot of AI music out there, but again, the problem that's coming forward is from the listeners. You would think, hey, there's more music, isn't that better? Not necessarily. They're listening to it. It's being listened to a lot, but their concern is like, hey, I can't even tell if this is AI music or if it's a real person. I want the authenticity. Music is highly emotional. I want to feel a connection to the people who are making that music. I want to know if that's a AI produced or not.
Right.
Or I want to know if it's an artist and they're using it as a tool, maybe that's okay. But these voices are coming out, and that's our role, is to listen to those voices and respond to that. So have that transparency for the customer. Some might be perfectly fine with AI music. There's lots of benefits to it. It could go on for hours with no breaks. But there is this need. And then for the other, customer or user, it's the artists. They're now not just competing against, we've got The Cure up here, who is still releasing albums. They're not just competing with them, but they're new artists. They're now competing with millions of songs that are flooding these catalogs. It's really hard for them. So discovery is still going to be a big issue. And I think it's the designer's role to help bridge those two worlds and help both of those groups. For the people who like it and find good utility in it, for those who do not, I think it's something that, that's our role, is to have that empathy, to listen, to understand, to deeply understand the tools, the benefits and the weaknesses, so we can then bring an opinion back to that table and say, this is our proposal based on what we've learned and our experience as professional designers. So that's kind of why I'm focusing on it right now. It's going deep. And the graphic here that you see, AI has been around for a while, just in different forms. There's been machine learning, but now it's generative AI with LLMs. So this was actually prepared by a Microsoft research team several years back. And these are some of the new lessons and rules that we need to think about as designers when we're building these interfaces. So the first one there, I think, is really important. Make it clear what the system can do, but also what it cannot do. And if it can't do it, later on you see, if it goes wrong, how do you correct it? So this is something I had to learn when I was working in voice design. It didn't work all the time. I don't want to open anybody's device, but who that starts with an A and ends with an X. Sometimes it wouldn't work. So as a designer, we had to really think through, how do we recover from that? So this is a great framework if you're beginning to work in AI design, and the rest of the design principles still apply. But this is kind of new rules to be aware of.
And I think what is I'm thinking back about a previous graphic you shared where you shifted from a linear sort of image to a circular one. And I imagine there's something at play there in terms of how designers work also. There are maybe core principles you are keeping as you design, but you're not perhaps moving forward in a linear time. You're having to kind of constantly refresh and revisit your strategies. And does that ring true? Does that sound accurate? Like an accurate way of talking about design work?
Yeah, and I think some of it might be the interface. When Don Norman first started his work in user-centered design and crafting these steps and process and principles, a lot of it was visual. It was the web. Now we have conversational interfaces, so voice or chat. And I remember when I shifted from more the visual to voice, and I felt like my brain was being rewired. I really had to understand language as an interface. And there are some great rules out there too that I learned from my voice design mentors. So, cooperative principle, which is just about the rules of good conversation. Be clear, be concise, be relevant. So there's a set of rules there that can also be applied. So yes, as designers, I think we have to constantly go out there and look for these trusted rules that we can then apply back to the work that we do. Being a visual designer and jumping straight into conversation design, we might start typing things down, and you realize later that writing is very different from speaking.
Right.
And they function very differently. It's like when you're talking to your phone and you're trying to, use voice to text to compose an email, and then you read it later and you're like, this sounds ridiculous.
Yeah.
So it's very much like that. And you kind of have to learn the rules around it. So we have to constantly be aware and constantly question, are we practicing design the right way, or is there something I need to learn?
Right. Okay. John, what do you think about this? Are there how do designers stay relevant, and what do you try to keep as sort of core foundations in your practice? Are your students asking questions about this as the design world is changing and technology is changing?
Yeah, I hope I can answer this. I feel like I'm not necessarily participating in yet, but witnessing this sort of seismic shift.
Yeah.
And that even in my own practice, like a few months ago, I remember saying, oh, well, interpretive planning will never be impacted by AI. And then I had this aha moment of, well, when we take on a new project and have to learn, we research hundreds of websites, look up hundreds of books, and all of a sudden I thought, well, AI could be great at sort of helping me parse through that and giving me more information to consider. But then the big part of it is whether you're using AI for generation of content or for research. What we want to teach the students is that really you need to be very good observers and understand principles of design, and particularly in the AI revolution, you may not be implementing the design. You may have tools that create it for you, but you need to recognize when that sentence doesn't communicate or doesn't work with the picture, or when these typographic elements are used incorrectly, et cetera, et cetera. So I think Lesley spoke about this as well, but I think part of what we're doing now is training people to be better observers, to know the design principles and how to apply them, and to sort of keep the practice of good design moving forward by recognizing when you see bad design or when something's done poorly or done wrong. And so in the classroom, it's recognizing that these tools exist and when you can use them and when you shouldn't be using them.
Okay. Well, I mean, I have lots of questions to ask, but I see that we're getting close on time, and I want to leave space for our guest to ask questions. So I'm going to ask one sort of maybe follow-up question to what I've just asked you. Do you have any advice for NASCAD students in the design program? John, you're working with students, obviously, as a teacher. Do you have anything else, any advice or kind of things you tell them in addition to what you've just said about entering this field now?
Maybe I can think about that for a moment. Is that all right, Lesley? Do you mind?
Yeah, Lesley, do you want to take a stab at it? What would you
Yeah.
say to NASCAD students today?
Yeah, well, I mean, everybody's learning right now. Professionals are learning. So jump into that and be curious about it. Build your opinion, understand what these tools are good at and what they're not good at. Again, like John was saying, recognize when it's wrong. Keep that critical thinking, keep that critical eye, because many people won't know that, and that's a skill that you have as a designer, and that won't go away.
Mhm.
So do that, and then don't forget, pick up the pen and pencil a lot. That shouldn't go
Yeah.
away either. It's fast. Maybe that's the advice. Resist the temptation to jump to high fidelity. I think with these tools being there, I'm seeing a lot of people in Figma make jump straight to like, this is the full polished end. And I look at the results, I'm like, I have so many questions. This looks like a final finished product, and it looks like you've already
Mhm.
gone through a lot of steps. I don't believe that's true. So keep your pencil sharp, sketch, draw, get ideas out, take some time away from those devices, or use it as a buddy. Use it as a way to say, like, I've got some of these ideas, like, let's kind of start a conversation and help me think through this. Ask me questions. That's something that's getting better, which I'm excited about, which is the prompting back. Have you considered this? It's like, great, let's go down that path. But then, in the end, it's synthetic. So
Mhm.
talk to real people in the end.
Okay,
Yeah,
and
I
keep
think
some
the
of that in
tools are
process.
So I think the tools are great for the iterative process, and it's remembering that you want to explore as many options in the short or long period that you have in order to start assessing them, evaluating them against your design brief, evaluating them against the personas, the journey maps, the problem to solve. And yeah, be open to using these tools, but again, it's about understanding that we are communicating with people in the end, and how best do I do that? And are the designs that are coming up appropriate? Do they work? Do they reach the
Mhm.
right audience?
Excellent. Thank you, guys. And well, something we were talking about before the meeting started was we were touching on AI a little bit, and the notion of if more customers are turning to creating their own designs, and then how that changes the relationship, like design as a language, and where designers kind of fit into this new world where maybe sometimes that process is removed. And I wonder, Lesley, if you have any thoughts on that. That wasn't a very eloquently phrased, but call back
No,
to
but
that.
yeah, I remember the conversation from earlier. Yeah, I think we were all hypothesizing, and we expect that there will be, just like we're seeing in other places, this like slop that's coming
Yeah.
out where people are using the tools, and that's great, and they're producing results, and they're excited about it. Those results might be great for one thing, but the design might be like, because they just don't have this skill. And even if
Yeah.
they can tell that it doesn't look great or something's not quite working, they don't have that language, they don't have that experience, that vocabulary to kind of translate that into like, well, how can I tell it to change this? I don't even really know. The joke we had was, make the logo bigger or make it pop more. So that's something that I think, again, hold it close as designers. There will continue to be that need. I think we'll see a lot of content out there, just like when people started blogging. What did
Mm.
that mean to people who were really great writers and journalists? There was a lot of content out there, and the great part about it is people who either couldn't get into that profession or never pursued it, or as a hobby, they could be actually really great writers, and they have the tool now to be able to do that. So we could see some really exciting things come out of it as well. I'd love to see the designers who
Mm.
have a great sense of how something should work building their own stuff, right? That's kind of like what I want to do. I'm like, I know enough code, I know enough about how
Okay.
it works
Okay.
that I have an idea, I can go through the process and actually build it. Otherwise, it's very difficult to do that on your own. So yeah, there could be some slop, but there could be some really great surprises as well.
Okay. Very interesting. John, I mean, this is like a kind of a different direction, but I was wondering if we could talk a bit about some of the projects that you've done in Halifax that people in town may have seen. I was thinking in particular about the writing you did about the Fort Needham Park, or your work with the Buddy Delmore Day Center. And can you talk a bit about those projects and what some of your strategies and research and interests were in maybe we'll start with Fort Needham and then the Buddy Day.
Sure. So Fort Needham, we went through typical public consultations. We employed the usual kind of questions, post-it notes, democracy, reviewing design, collecting information from the public, coming back and presenting that and getting confirmation. Are we hearing the right things? Are we moving in the right direction? Is this what you want? These are the things you don't want. With the Fort Needham Park in particular, um, I think one of the rewarding things, and this is less human-centered design, but it is something, it's
Mm,
an emotional side of design, but thank you. There's a few sides there, but that's great. That I was often reminded that, or maybe tell people, Fort Needham Memorial Park was designed to commemorate the 100th anniversary or the anniversary of the 1917 Halifax explosion.
mm,
And we were tasked with revamping this underutilized and somewhat kind of neglected public space. And so through public consultation, we learned what people wanted. But what I was reminded of was that while one day of the year it's about commemoration, there are 364 days of the year when it was about outdoor activity, recreation, etc. And so for me, it was more problem solving of how do I ensure the history of this catastrophe is carried forward and moves on, but without making the experience of going to the park really depressing and talking about
right.
how many people were
Mhm,
killed, etc. And so that involved a number of things, but sort of using the landscape to create this sculptural elements that
mhm,
reveal themselves on the first visit, second visit. Sometimes I've had people say, "Oh, I didn't discover this piece of the park until my 10th visit. I had no idea it was there." So it was for me creating a set of interventions in the landscape that told the story of the explosion for those who wanted to understand it, but also be a really great experience. That staircase that you showed it right there is maybe one of those examples where we put a staircase in, and at the bottom of the stairs where the photographer is standing, you would have been in the heart of the community of Richmond, and Richmond was wiped off the face of the earth, never to return in
right.
name nor function. And at this one spot, Richmond is carved into the treads, the risers of each stair. But as you walk up the stair, the name slowly obliterates and disappears, much like the memory of Richmond, but also sort
Mm,
of the nod to the explosion as well. And the balustrades there are these little Corten steel elements. One of the After the explosion, there was an explosion, there was a tsunami, and then something called black rain, where all the debris fell back to Earth and punctured the Earth. So these balustrades sort of talk about the all the organizations that never returned. So,
mm.
yeah, it was less human centered, but I would say it very much had a focus on user experience and what does it feel like to engage with the elements in this park, and that balance between being informative and interesting to look at, but not overwhelming and depressing based on the content.
Yeah, and how effective design helps us sort of like create new visions of a place that we're so familiar with, right? Like I've been in that park a million times, but it wasn't until that redesign that I maybe learned more about, um, yeah, like how that neighborhood was affected by the explosion.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And I just think that, in the case of that type of work, the work doesn't have to be didactic. It doesn't
Right.
have to spell out you are looking at the former blah, blah, blah and have text.
Uh,
Make it experiential, put things in the landscape that people can experience and touch and put their own meaning into it or discover meaning was designed into it that, doesn't have to be described in words, but the experience of looking at it 10, 15, 20 times, you see something or understand something more. So that's the type of work I do.
I think that's so interesting, and I think it seems to me fits in with some of the conversations about wayfinding because it's so much about your relationship to moving through a space and
Yeah.
how what you see and how you come to understand things by physically being there. Yeah.
How people engage with the space. And again, user personas, journey maps, all these things are the regular tools that we use when we're mapping everything out from UX UI to signage and navigating a downtown environment or a campus to how someone experiences a park. I think the tools in human-centered design processes can be used on any given project, and they're immensely valuable at sort of having a better connection or empathy
Mm,
with the people you're trying to connect with.
wonderful. Yeah, I think empathy is a great sort of overarching theme for this process. So thank you. Well, we have time for just maybe like a quick question for you, Lesley. Is there a project we talked a bit about your work with Amazon and what was so sort of impactful there, but are there any other projects that you did in your career that feel very foundational or significant that you want to touch on?
Yeah, there were definitely many. Gosh, I don't know if I can think of just one, but maybe I'd just like go
More.
back to um, uh, what I was saying about the voice design. It was just such
Mm,
a transition and such an awakening of understanding how design, practices can change depending on what's the interface being used. And I love the example of the wayfinding, again, the experience of the body and going through an experience like that. But in voice design, it was, I really dismantled sentences and I learned
mm,
how that these devices, there's a lot of strain on instead of recognizing what's on the screen, you need to recall what you heard. It's highly ephemeral. It's there and then it's gone. And, it's got almost no interface. And
mhm.
you leave it up to the customer to figure out how to use it and just trial and error. So it was just such a steep learning curve. And then on top of that, it was just the documentation. So bringing in how I documented designs or journeys in a visual space, how I could then do that in the voice space, because a lot of it was, it's language. Oh, that design is an email. And it's like, no, 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 that's not how we do it. There's dialogue flows. And then through mapping out those dialogue flows, I would then see holes in the project proposal. And I'm like, this is broken. If you ship it this way, this is what's going to happen. And sometimes, again, back to the system, in the end, I was advocating for another services customer. I was like, this
Mm.
customer is going to be very confused if this happens. And so bringing that and going outside of the organization to advocate on multiple customers' behalves, um, there were just so many challenges like that, but it built a great community and great bridges across organizations as well. So I just appreciated that opportunity so much.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, well, I think that's a really great place to wrap up. Thank you, Lesley and John, so much for joining us today. It was so interesting to hear about your careers and about these practices. And join us next time for the next artwork. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you so much.